Some folks say the measure of a person isn't found in how they stand when everything's going right. It's in how they carry themselves when the whole world seems bent on pushing them down. This is a story from the old frontier, back in the 1880s when Wyoming was still wild and towns like Copper Bend were just starting to put down roots. It's about a young woman named Clara Bennett who found herself in a hard spot, the kind that makes you wonder if there's any good left in people. And it's about a cowboy named Luke Callahan, who didn't have much to offer except an honest question at the right moment. I wrote this for those of you who remember when a handshake meant something, when neighbors helped neighbors without being asked, when a person's word was their bond, if you've ever been counted out, or if you've ever given someone a chance when nobody else would well. This story's for you. The bell above Mrs. Thornton's door was still ringing when Clara Bennett stepped onto the boardwalk. 3. That made 3 in one afternoon. She kept her chin level, her spine straight. The way Mama had taught her before the fever took both her parents and left Clara with nothing but good posture and a talent for arithmetic. Behind her, through the shop window, she could see Mrs. Thornton already turning back to her bolts of calico. The woman who had smiled so warmly 2 hours ago when Clara first walked in asking about the help wanted notice. The same woman who had just looked at Clara like she'd tracked something foul across the clean-swept floor. "I'm sorry, dear. Position's been filled just this morning." The lie had been delivered so smoothly, as if Mrs. Thornton had practiced it. Perhaps she had. Clara moved down the boardwalk, her heels made small. Deliberate sounds against the wood. Click, click, click. Not too fast. Never let them see you run. Whispers floated from the mercantile porch where 3 women sat pretending to shell peas. "That's her, ain't it? The auction girl?" Stood right up on that platform, bold as brass. Nobody even bid. Can you imagine the shame? Clara's fingers tightened around the worn handle of her bag. Inside it, 1 change of underclothes. A hairbrush with 3 broken bristles. 14 cents. A letter of reference from the Waverly Home for Women that she now understood was worth less than the paper it was written on. The afternoon sun beat down hard on Main Street, and she could smell the dust rising from the road, that particular dry Wyoming smell of baked earth and horse and sage carried on a hot wind. Somewhere down the street, the church bell tolled 3 times, marking the hour. A child laughed near the general store. Life went on for everyone else in Copper Bend. She had arrived 3 weeks ago on a stagecoach packed with 11 other women, all of them bound for the frontier bride auction that the Waverly home had arranged, a chance at a new life. They'd been told. Respectable marriages to hard-working men who needed wives. What the matrons hadn't mentioned was the viewing, the way the men walked along the line of women like farmers inspecting livestock. The questions shouted from the crowd. That one cook, she got all her teeth. What about the skinny one? She's strong enough for farm work. Clara had stood at the end of the line, lot number 12. 23 years old with ink-stained fingers and a face that was pleasant enough but nothing special. When the auctioneer called her number, she had stepped forward onto the raised platform. The afternoon sun had been in her eyes. She remembered that. Remembered squinting into the crowd of faces. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer had called again. Lowered the suggested contribution. Still nothing. "Come now, gentlemen. Fine, healthy woman here. Good teeth. Can read and write?" That last part had been a mistake. She'd watched the men's faces close up like shutters against a storm. A woman who could read. A woman who could write. A woman who might have opinions. The bidding never started. Now Clara walked past the feed store where she'd asked about keeping inventory this morning, past the hotel where she'd inquired about work in the kitchen, past the livery stable where old Mr. Henricks had actually seemed interested in hiring her to manage his accounts until his wife came in and recognized Clara's face. At the end of Main Street, the boardwalk gave way to dirt. A public horse corral stood there, empty, save for one old roan mare who'd been left to drink from the wooden trough. Clara stopped at the fence rail. This was as far as she could go without leaving town entirely. And where would she go? Back to the Waverly home. They wouldn't take her. Once a woman failed at auction. She was on her own. To Denver. Maybe. Where no one knew her face. She had 14 cents. The stage fare was $8. The mare ambled over, her brown eyes soft and curious. She pushed her velvety muzzle against Clara's palm, snuffling for treats. "Sorry, old girl." Clara's voice came out rough. She hadn't spoken to anyone in hours who wasn't turning her away. "I haven't got anything for you." The horse didn't seem to mind. She stood there, warm and patient, while Clara scratched behind her ear. The only creature in Copper Bend who didn't care what Clara was or what she'd done. What had she done? Really, stood on a platform. Failed to be wanted. Was that a crime now? The afternoon shadows stretched longer. Soon she would have to return to the boarding house where she rented a room by the week. Mrs. Crawford hadn't said anything yet, but Clara had seen the looks. The other boarders had complained. A decent establishment, they'd whispered. Shouldn't harbor that sort of woman. Never mind that Clara had never done anything indecent in her life. Never mind that she'd been raised in a good home by loving parents before cholera swept through their town. Never mind that she'd spent 7 years at the Waverly home learning to cook and clean and keep accounts, all the skills a respectable wife should have. None of it mattered now. She was the auction girl, the one nobody wanted. Behind her, she heard the heavy creak of wagon wheels, the plod of hooves. She didn't turn around. Probably just another rancher passing through. Another face that would recognize her and look away. The wagon slowed. Stopped. Clara kept her eyes on the mare, her hand on the rough fence rail. If she ignored whoever it was, maybe they'd move on. "You've been standing there a while." The voice was low, unhurried, like the man had all the time in the world and figured everyone else did too. Clara's shoulders tensed. Here it comes, she thought. The crude remark, the suggestion. She'd had 3 of those already this week from men who figured an unwanted woman was a desperate one. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said to the fence post. "Didn't say you were—" A pause. The creak of leather as the man climbed down from the wagon seat. Boots on packed dirt. He moved around to the trough, and she heard him unhitch one of his horses, let it drink. "Name's Callahan," he said. "Luke Callahan. Run a stock station up past Miller's Creek." Clara didn't respond. She was trying to remember if she'd seen him at the auction. The faces had blurred together by the end, but this voice she didn't think she'd heard it before. "You the one from the auction 3 weeks back." There it was. Clara's jaw tightened. "What if I am? Just asking." His tone didn't change. No mockery in it. No pity either. "Saw you standing up there. Saw you walk off when it was done." She finally turned to look at him. He was maybe 30. Lean and weathered the way men got out here, with sun-creased skin and eyes the color of creek water. His hat was dusty. His shirt faded from too many washings. His leather vest worn soft at the edges. A working man. Not rich. Not poor. Just ordinary. "You here to make me an offer, Mr. Callahan?" She didn't bother keeping the edge out of her voice. "Because I'll save you the trouble. I'm not that kind of woman." Something flickered in his expression. Not offense. Something closer to respect. "Wasn't going to make that kind of offer, ma'am." "Then what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. His horse finished drinking and nudged his shoulder, and he reached up to pat its neck without looking away from Clara. "I saw you coming out of the feed store this morning," he said. "And the hotel. And Mrs. Thornton's." Clara's cheeks flushed hot. So he'd been watching her get turned away. All day. Just what she needed, a witness to her humiliation. "That's my business." "Reckon it is." He nodded slowly. I'm just wondering what kind of work you looking for. The question stopped her cold. She'd been asked a lot of things since arriving in Copper Bend. Are you the auction girl? Are you spoken for? Are you hungry enough yet to reconsider? No one had asked what she wanted. I beg your pardon. Work, he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. What do you know how to do? Clara stared at him. The mare nudged her hand, impatient for more scratching, and she reached over absently to oblige. I can keep books, she heard herself say. I read, I write, I can manage accounts, track inventory, figure sums. Callahan nodded. Still no reaction on his face, just listening. Anything else? I can cook some, clean, nothing fancy, but I can manage a household. The books part, he said. That's what you're good at. Yes. It came out almost defiant. I'm good at numbers. Always have been. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon sun was behind him now, casting his face in shadow. She couldn't read his expression. I got a stock station needs someone to keep the ledgers straight, he said finally. Small outfit. Just me and an old hand named Silas. We take in horses, board 'em, trade 'em. Nothing fancy. Clara's heart was beating too fast. She forced herself to breathe, to think. This was probably another trick, another cruel joke at the auction girl's expense. And what would you want in return, Mr. Callahan? Honest work. He said it like it should be obvious. Pays fair, $1.50 a week, plus room and board. Small room behind the office with its own door, lock and key. Why me? The words came out sharper than she intended. Why not someone from town, someone respectable? He tilted his head slightly, considering the question. Folks in town, they got opinions about who I should hire. I got opinions about minding my own business. He paused. You need work. I need someone who can make sense of a ledger book. Seems simple enough. Nothing's that simple. Some things are, ma'am, if you let 'em be. He walked back to his wagon and climbed up onto the seat, gathered the reins in his hands. The horse that had been drinking was hitched back in place now, and the wagon creaked as the team shifted their weight. Station's a half-mile past the church, up the hill road. You can come by tomorrow if you want to see the place. Look at the books. Decide if it suits you. He touched the brim of his hat. No obligation either way. Clara watched him go. The wagon wheels turned slowly, kicking up small clouds of dust. He didn't look back, didn't try to convince her or press his case, just made his offer and left. The old mare nudged Clara's hand again. What do you think? Clara murmured. Is he for real? The horse had no opinion to offer, just warm breath and patient eyes. Clara stood there until the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road, until the shadows stretched long and the air turned cool, and the first evening star appeared above the distant mountains. She had been asked 100 questions since arriving in Copper Bend. Are you the auction girl? Are you decent? Are you worth the trouble? Only one man had asked the right one. What kind of work you looking for tomorrow? She would find out if his offer was real. Tonight, for the first time in 3 weeks. She had something that felt almost like hope. If this story brought back memories of small-town kindness or times when someone gave you a fair chance, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. As the old saying goes, good company makes the road seem shorter. Clara woke before dawn. She lay still on the narrow boarding house bed, listening to the creak of floorboards as Mrs. Crawford moved about in the kitchen below. The smell of coffee drifted up through the gaps in the planking, bitter and strong, the kind that stuck to your teeth and kept you moving through a long morning. Her fingers found the edge of the thin blanket, traced the frayed stitching. She had counted the roses in the wallpaper pattern 17 times since arriving here. 43 roses, some of them water-stained, some peeling at the corners. What kind of work you looking for? The question had circled through her mind all night. She She had examined it from every angle the way she might examine a column of figures that refused to balance, looking for the error, the trick, the hidden cost. Men didn't ask questions like that, not to women like her. She dressed in the gray light. The same calico dress she'd worn yesterday, her only dress now. The blue one having been traded for 2 weeks' room and board. She pinned her hair back, splashed water on her face from the chipped basin. The woman in the small mirror looked tired, older than 23. Downstairs, Mrs. Crawford stood at the stove with her back turned. The kitchen smelled of bacon grease and wood smoke, but no plate waited on the table for Clara. "I'll be out most of the morning," Clara said. That was all. No inquiry about where she was going, no offer of breakfast. The silence said everything. Clara stepped out into the cool morning air. The town was just waking. A shopkeeper swept the boardwalk in front of his store, the bristles scratching against wood in a steady rhythm. 2 men stood talking outside the barber shop, their breath fogging in the early chill. A dog trotted down the middle of the street with someplace important to be. Clara turned away from Main Street, toward the church with its small white steeple, toward the hill road beyond. Her boots crunched on the packed dirt. The sun crested the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the sage-dotted hills. Somewhere a meadowlark called, its song bright and sharp in the stillness. Half a mile past the church, he'd said. She walked. The road curved around a low rise, and then she saw it. A modest spread tucked into the lee of the hill. A barn that needed paint. A corral with 6 horses standing in the morning light. A small building that might be an office, with a covered porch and a wooden sign that read, Callahan's Stock Station. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stovepipe. Someone was already awake. Clara stopped at the gate. Her hand rested on the rough-hewn post. The wood was warm where the sun touched it, cool in the shadows. This was the moment. She could turn around, walk back to town, find some other way, or she could open the gate. The door of the office swung open. An old man stepped onto the porch, white hair, stooped shoulders, a half-carved piece of wood in one hand, a knife in the other. He squinted at her through the morning light. "You, the bookkeeper." Clara's throat tightened. So Callahan had told someone she was coming, had expected her to show up after all. "I might be," she said. "Depends." The old man studied her for a long moment. Then he turned his head and called back through the open door. "Luke, she's here." Footsteps inside, the creak of floorboards. And then Luke Callahan appeared in the doorway, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, looking at her like he'd known all along she would come. The question was, how had he known, when Clara herself hadn't been sure until this very moment? Luke Callahan didn't smile when he saw her, didn't frown either. He just stood there in the doorway, coffee cup steaming in the morning air, and waited. Clara pushed open the gate. The hinges groaned, a long, low sound that echoed across the quiet yard. A horse in the corral lifted its head, ears pricked forward, watching her cross the hard-packed dirt. "Miss Bennett." Luke stepped down from the porch. "Glad you came." "I haven't decided anything yet." "Fair enough." He gestured toward the office door. "Come see what you'd be working with. Then you can decide." The old man Silas, she remembered, had retreated to a chair at the corner of the porch. His knife moved steadily over the wood in his hands, each stroke deliberate and sure. Shavings curled onto the boards at his feet, pale against the weathered gray. He didn't look up as Clara passed. Inside, the office smelled of coffee grounds and leather, and something faintly sweet, molasses, maybe. Or old wood seasoned by years of sun through the window. A potbelly stove crouched in one corner, its iron sides ticking with heat. 2 chairs, a desk cluttered with papers, bridles hanging on pegs along the wall, And on the desk, a ledger book. Clara moved toward it without thinking. The cover was brown leather, cracked at the spine, soft from years of handling. She opened it to the first page of entries. The handwriting inside made her wince. Numbers scrawled at odd angles. Entries that started on one line and wandered on to the next. Dates written in 3 different formats across the same month. Some pages had been left blank entirely, then picked up again with no explanation. "Told you it was a mess," Luke said from behind her. Clara turned a page, then another. Her finger traced down a column of figures, adding them in her head. "You've got $20 unaccounted for in March alone." "That's so. And this entry here," she tapped a line halfway down the page. "You wrote Bay Mare sold, but there's no price recorded. No buyer name, nothing. Probably forgot to write it down. That's not how bookkeeping works, Mr. Callahan." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Reckon that's why I need help." Clara closed the ledger. Her hands were steadier now. This was familiar ground. Numbers didn't whisper behind your back. Figures didn't care where you came from or what you'd done. They either balanced or they didn't. "Show me the rest," she said. Luke led her through the office to a small room at the back. A single window faced east, letting in a square of morning light that fell warm across the wooden floor. An iron-frame bed with a blue and white quilt. The stitches small and even. Someone had made this with care. A washstand with a basin and pitcher, both white porcelain with tiny chips at the rims. A small mirror hung on the wall. A wooden chair in the corner, simple, clean, private. The room smelled of cedar and fresh air, like someone had opened the window recently to let out the mustiness. Door's got its own lock. Luke pulled a key from his vest pocket and held it out. The iron was dark with age, worn smooth where countless fingers had gripped it. "This'd be yours. Nobody else has a copy." Clara didn't take it. "Not yet." "Why are you doing this?" The question hung in the air between them. Luke's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of something old. Something he kept buried. "Man named Emmett raised me," he said. "Found me at a church orphanage when I was 8 years old. Took me out to his ranch. Taught me everything I know about horses." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Never once asked where I came from. Never asked about my people or why I was there. Just asked if I wanted to learn." Clara waited. The stove ticked in the other room. Outside, a horse nickered softly. "I figure maybe that's how it ought to be," Luke said, turning back to her. "You ask what somebody can do, not what they've been through." From the porch came the sound of Silas's voice, low and gravelly, talking to one of the horses like it was an old friend. The stove ticked again. A fly buzzed against the window glass, trying to find its way out. Clara reached out and took the key. It was warm from Luke's pocket. Small, iron. The teeth worn smooth from years of use. She closed her fingers around it and felt the metal press into her palm. The weight of it surprised her, not heavy, but solid, real. $1.50 a week, she said. "Room and board included." "That's right." "I start today." Luke nodded. No handshake, no ceremony. Just a nod, like they'd known each other for years, and this was simply the next step in a long conversation. "Ledger's all yours. Silas makes dinner around 6. You need anything, holler." He left, his boots quiet on the wooden floor. Clara stood alone in the small room. Her room now. The first space that had been truly hers since the fever took her parents 7 years ago. She turned the key over in her hand, watching the light catch the worn edges. A door with a lock, a key that belonged to no one else. Such a small thing, such an ordinary thing, but standing there in that square of morning sunlight. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, a tightness she hadn't known she'd been carrying. She set her bag on the bed, looked around at the bare walls, the simple furniture, the blue and white quilt with its careful stitches. Then she walked back to the office and sat down at the desk. The ledger waited. She opened it to the first page of entries, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper from a drawer, and began to work. The numbers were a disaster, but disasters could be fixed, given enough time, given enough patience, given someone who cared enough to try. By noon, she had found 47 errors. By mid-afternoon, she had reconstructed 3 months of missing transactions from scattered receipts stuffed in a drawer like old leaves. By the time the light turned golden through the window and the shadows stretched long across the desk, she had a list of questions that needed answers. Horses sold with no records, payments received with no source noted, names that appeared once and never again. Silas appeared in the doorway. His shadow fell across her papers. "Supper's on." Clara looked up. Her neck ached from hunching over the desk. Her eyes burned from squinting at faded ink. She realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday. "I'll be there in a minute." The old man studied her for a moment. Something in his weathered face that might have been approval, or maybe just curiosity. "You work like you mean it," he said. "I always do." He turned to go, then stopped. His hand rested on the door frame, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter. "Word of advice, miss. Some of them gaps in the books, they ain't mistakes." Clara's pen stilled on the paper. "What do you mean?" But Silas was already gone, his footsteps fading across the porch, leaving only the smell of cooking beans and the distant sound of horses settling in for the night. Clara looked back at the ledger, at the missing entries, the gaps, the transactions that seemed to vanish into thin air. If they weren't mistakes, then what were they? And what exactly had she just agreed to be part of? The gaps in the ledger weren't theft. Clara discovered this on her third morning at the station, when she finally gathered enough courage to ask Luke directly. She found him in the corral, running a brush down the flank of a gray gelding. The horse stood patient and still, its tail flicking lazily at flies that buzzed in the warm air. Morning sun slanted through the fence rails, casting long shadows across the packed dirt. "Mr. Callahan." He looked up. Brush paused mid-stroke. "Miss Bennett. I need to ask you about some entries in the books." "All right." Clara held up a piece of paper covered in her neat handwriting. "In February, you took in a horse from someone named Walsh. Brown mare, 15 hands. There's no payment recorded." Luke went back to brushing, long, steady strokes that made the horse's coat gleam. "That's right. And in March, you gave 2 sacks of oats to the Miller family. No charge." "Mm-hmm." "And here," she pointed to another line, "a man named Dawson. You boarded his horse for 3 weeks. The only payment listed is labor, fence repair." The brush moved in the same unhurried rhythm. The horse shifted its weight, leaning into Luke's hand. "Walsh lost his wife last winter," Luke said. "Fever took her, same as it takes so many out here. He needed to sell the mare to pay for the doctor bills that didn't save her, but nobody in town would give him a fair price. So I took her, told him to pay when he could." Clara waited. A meadowlark sang somewhere beyond the corral fence. The Millers got 4 kids and a farm that barely feeds them. Their draft horse needed grain to get through planting season. Didn't seem right to charge full price for something they needed just to survive. And Dawson's got no money, but he's handy with a hammer. I needed a new fence section anyway. Luke straightened up and looked at her, his eyes steady. "That answer your questions?" Clara stared at the paper in her hand. All those gaps she'd been trying to fill, all those missing payments she'd assumed were errors or oversights. "You've been giving things away," she said. "I've been helping folks who need it. But your books are a mess, I know." He hung the brush on a fence post and wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving faint dust marks on the worn fabric. Numbers and me never got along. Horses. I understand. People. Mostly. Numbers just don't stick in my head the way they should. Clara looked back at the ledger entries. A different picture was forming now. Not carelessness, not incompetence. Just a man who cared more about his neighbors than what was left over at the end of the month. You should still record these transactions, she said. Even the ones without payment. It's the only way to know where you actually stand. Can you do that? Make it so everything balances out proper. I can make the books accurate. Mr. Callahan, whether they balance is up to you. Something shifted in his expression. That almost smile again. The one that barely touched the corners of his mouth but softened his whole face. Fair enough. From the porch, Silas called out, "Coffee's ready. Either of you want some? Better come get it before I drink the whole pot myself." They walked back to the office together. Not quite side by side, Clara kept a careful distance, but not as far apart as before either. The morning air smelled of sage and horse, and the particular dusty sweetness of Wyoming in late spring. Inside, Silas had laid out 3 tin cups on the desk, steam rising from each one in thin curls. A plate of cold biscuits sat beside them, left over from the night before, their tops golden brown and cracked. Clara took her cup and wrapped her hands around it. The metal was almost too hot to hold, but she didn't let go. The warmth felt good against her palms, chasing away the lingering chill of the morning. "How'd you end up working here?" she asked Silas. The old man settled into his chair by the window and picked up his whittling. The shape was clearer now, a horse, she could see, with its head turned to one side as if listening to something only it could hear. "Same way you did, I reckon. Showed up when I needed a place. Luke didn't ask too many questions. That seems to be his way." "It is." Silas's knife moved in short. Precise strokes. Shavings fell to the floor in pale spirals. Man could charge double what he does for boarding. Could turn away folks who can't pay full price. He doesn't, though. Why not? You'd have to ask him that. Clara glanced through the window. Luke was back in the corral, leading out another horse for grooming. His movements were unhurried, patient. He said something to the animal, too low for her to hear, and the horse's ears swiveled toward him like he was speaking its language. "He's not what I expected," she said. Silas snorted, a dry sound without malice. "What'd you expect, some rancher looking to take advantage?" The heat rose to Clara's cheeks. That was exactly what she'd expected. What she'd been bracing for since the moment she decided to walk up that hill road. "Can't blame you for thinking it," Silas said, his voice softer now. "World gives a woman plenty of reasons to be careful. Just saying Luke ain't that kind. Never has been." Clara sipped her coffee. It was strong and bitter, the way she was learning to like it. On the desk beside her, the ledger waited with its crooked columns and missing entries and stories hidden between the lines. "Your hands," she said suddenly, watching the old man work. "They shake." Silas paused his whittling, looked down at his fingers. They trembled slightly, a fine vibration that never quite stopped, even when he held them still. "Palsy," he said. "Had it for years now. Gets worse when I'm tired or when the weather turns cold." "Is that why nobody else would hire me?" He chuckled, a dry sound with no bitterness in it. "That's right. Hard to work cattle when you can't hold a rope steady. Hard to do most things that pay decent wages. Actually, but Luke hired you anyway. Luke hired me anyway." Silas went back to his carving, the knife moving with surprising sureness despite the tremor in his grip. "Turns out there's plenty of work that don't need steady hands. Cooking, mending tack, keeping an eye on things when he's away." He glanced at her, his faded blue eyes sharp. "Talking sense into stubborn young women who think the whole world's out to get them." Clara almost smiled. Almost. The morning passed into afternoon. She returned to the ledger, reconstructing the history of Luke's quiet generosity, one entry at a time. The Walsh mare, recorded properly now with a note about deferred payment. The Miller Oats, logged as a charitable contribution. The Dawson boarding fee, converted to labor credit with a detailed description of work performed. By the time the sun reached its peak and began its slow descent, the books were starting to make sense, not just the numbers, the whole picture. This wasn't a failing business run by a careless man. This was a small outpost of stubborn decency in a world that didn't always reward such things. Around 6 o'clock, Silas called them to supper. The table was small, barely big enough for 3. Silas had set out bowls of beans, thick and brown, swimming in molasses and bits of salt pork, and a skillet of cornbread still warm from the stove. The smell filled the small room, savory and sweet and deeply familiar, the kind of food that stuck to your ribs and made you grateful for simple things. Luke bowed his head for a moment before eating, didn't say anything out loud, just closed his eyes and moved his lips slightly. Silas did the same. Clara watched them, then lowered her own head, remembering how her mother used to do this before every meal. When she looked up, Luke was passing her the cornbread. She took a piece. It was golden and crumbly, with a sweetness that lingered on her tongue. The beans were rich and smoky, better than anything she'd eaten at the boarding house. "This is good," she said to Silas. "Oughta be. Made it the same way for 40 years. He sopped up bean juice with his cornbread. "My wife taught me. Said a man who couldn't feed himself wasn't worth much." She sounds wise. She was. Something softened in his weathered face. Gone now. 12 years this autumn. The meal continued in comfortable silence. Clara found herself eating more than she had in weeks. The food sat warm in her stomach, and the company, strange as it was, felt easier than anything she'd known since arriving in Copper Bend. After supper, she helped clear the dishes while Luke went to check on the horses. The evening light slanted through the windows, turning everything gold. Silas handed her a dish towel. "You did good work today," he said. "The books look better than they have in years. There's still more to do." "Always is." He washed a bowl, his hands steady in the warm water despite their tremor. "But you got a knack for it, for seeing what the numbers mean, not just what they say." Clara dried the bowl and set it on the shelf. "It's just arithmetic." "No, it ain't." Silas looked at her, his eyes serious. "Arithmetic is adding and subtracting. What you do is read people through their receipts. That's something different altogether." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The last of the light faded outside. Clara returned to her room, lit the lamp on the small table, and sat on the edge of the bed. The blue and white quilt was soft under her hands. The room smelled of cedar and the lingering warmth of the day. She thought about what Silas had said, about reading people through their receipts. She thought about Luke's ledger, full of gaps that weren't mistakes at all, but acts of kindness he never bothered to record properly. She thought about the key in her pocket and the lock on her door, and what it meant to have a place that was hers. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Bennett felt something other than tired, something other than scared. She felt like she might belong somewhere. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified her. Because the last time she'd let herself believe she belonged somewhere, she'd lost everything. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a question lingered, one she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. If Luke Callahan was really as decent as he seemed, why did his business have so few customers? And why had no one in town warned her to stay away? The answer came on a Thursday afternoon, wearing polished boots and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Clara heard the horse before she saw it. Heavy hoofbeats on the hill road, moving faster than most riders bothered to push their mounts in this heat. She looked up from the ledger, her pen hovering over a half-finished entry. Through the window, she watched a man ride into the yard, tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders. His coat was too fine for ranch work, the fabric dark and brushed clean of dust. Silver glinted on his bridle, catching the afternoon sun. Luke emerged from the barn, a coil of rope in his hands. He stood in the middle of the yard and waited, his posture easy but watchful. The rider dismounted. He was older than Luke, maybe 45, with gray threading through his dark hair and a face that might have been handsome once before it settled into permanent lines of calculation. Callahan. The man's voice carried across the yard, smooth and confident. Been a while. Garrett. Luke's tone gave nothing away. What brings you out here? Clara's fingers tightened on her pen. She knew that name. Had seen it in the ledger 3 times, always associated with large transactions that never quite added up. Garrett walked toward the office, his boots leaving prints in the dust. His eyes swept across the property, the corral, the barn, the small building where Clara sat, and something flickered in his expression. Satisfaction. Maybe. Or hunger. Then his gaze found her through the window. He stopped walking. Well now. His smile widened, showing too many teeth. That's the girl from the auction. Ain't it? The one nobody wanted. Clara's stomach clenched. She didn't move. Didn't look away. Luke stepped between Garrett and the office, blocking his view. Miss Bennett keeps my books. You got business to discuss. You discuss it with me. Didn't know you was in the charity business. Callahan. Garrett's voice dripped with mock surprise. Taking in strays now. That's real Christian of you. I hire who I hire. That ain't your concern. Everything in this valley is my concern. Garrett stepped to the side, trying to catch another glimpse of Clara. Luke moved with him, smooth and deliberate. I own half the grazing land between here and the mountains. What happens on the other half affects me whether I like it or not. Clara forced herself to keep writing. Her pen scratched across the paper, recording numbers she wasn't really seeing. The ink blotted on one figure, spreading like a dark stain. State your business or move on, Luke said. I got work to do. Fine. I'll make it simple. Garrett hooked his thumbs in his belt, his posture shifting to something more aggressive. I want to buy this station, the land, the water rights, all of it. I'll give you a fair price, more than fair, considering the state of things. Not interested. You ain't even heard my offer. Don't need to. Station's not for sale. Garrett's smile thinned. The friendliness drained from his face, leaving something harder underneath. That's what you said last year. And the year before that? But things change. Callahan, a man's circumstances can shift awful quick out here. Luke said nothing. His hands hung loose at his sides, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself, like a man ready to move fast if he needed to. I've been patient, Garrett continued. Real patient, but my patience has limits. He glanced toward the office again, and this time his eyes found Clara's through the glass. Especially when a man makes choices that hurt his reputation, choices that make folks wonder about his judgment. The meaning was clear. Clara's pen went still. Her hand trembled slightly, and she pressed it flat against the desk to hide the shaking. My judgment is my own business, Luke said quietly. Same as my land. For now. Garrett turned back to his horse, gathering the reins in one gloved hand. But you think about what I said. Think about what happens when folks around here decide they'd rather not do business with a man who keeps company with... He paused, letting the silence fill in the word he didn't say. Well, you understand. He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, looked down at Luke from the saddle, and the mask of civility slipped completely. This valley's changing. Callahan. Men like you, men who think they can run things their own way, you're going to find out real soon that there's a cost to stubbornness. He tugged his horse's head around. I'll be back, and next time, my offer won't be so generous. He rode out at a gallop, dust rising behind him in a thick cloud that drifted slowly across the yard. Luke stood motionless until the hoofbeats faded completely. Then he walked to the office. His boots were heavy on the porch steps. The door opened, and he came inside, bringing the smell of dust and horse and something sharp, like the air before lightning strikes. Clara set down her pen. Her hands were shaking now, and she couldn't hide it. "Who was that?" she asked, though she already knew. "Nathaniel Garrett." Luke moved to the stove, poured himself coffee from the pot Silas always kept warm. His hand, Clara noticed, wasn't quite steady either. "Owns the biggest spread in the county. Been trying to buy this land for 3 years now. Why does he want it so badly?" "Water." Luke drank half the coffee in one swallow, his jaw tight. "Miller's Creek runs right through this property. Whoever controls the water controls every rancher downstream. That's how men like Garrett think everything's leverage. Everything's a deal." Clara looked down at the ledger, at all the careful entries she'd made over the past week. The Walsh mare, the Miller oats, the Dawson fence repair. "He knows who I am," she said. "He knows. He's going to use it against you." Luke set down his cup. The tin made a hollow sound against the desk. "Probably." "Then maybe I should go." The words came out flat, practiced. She'd been preparing to say them since the moment Garrett rode into the yard. "Before I make things worse for you." "No." The word was quiet but final. "Mr. Callahan." "Luke." He met her eyes. "If we're going to have this conversation, you might as well call me Luke." Clara swallowed. "Luke, I've been through this before. The whispers. The looks. I know how it ends. People stop coming. Business dries up. And eventually..." She stopped, her throat tight. "Eventually what?" "Eventually it's easier for everyone if I just disappear." Luke was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside, a horse whinnied in the corral, answered by another. "When I was 10 years old," he said. "The other kids at the orphanage used to call me Throwaway. Said my folks must have been no good. Otherwise, why'd they leave me on the church steps like that?" He picked up his coffee cup, stared into it like he might find something there. "Emmett, the man who raised me, he heard about it once. You know what he said?" Clara shook her head. "He said, people talk because it makes them feel bigger than they are. Don't mean you gotta shrink to make room for their noise." Luke looked up at her, his eyes steady. "You ain't a throwaway, Clara, and you ain't a burden. You're someone who does her work and does it well. That's all that matters here." Something cracked in Clara's chest. A wall she'd been building for 3 years. Since the Waverly home, since the auction, since she'd learned that the world saw her as disposable. "Garrett will make trouble," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably. People might stop doing business with you. Some might. Some won't. You could lose everything." Luke set down his cup and met her gaze. "I've lost things before. Still here." The afternoon light slanted through the window, casting long rectangles of gold across the floor. Dust motes drifted in the light, slow and aimless. Clara picked up her pen, looked at the ledger, at the neat columns she'd spent the last week building from chaos. "All right," she said, "but if things get bad, they won't. If they do, I need you to tell me. Don't try to protect me from it. I've survived worse than gossip." Luke nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He turned to go, then stopped at the door. His hand rested on the frame, and he was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding whether to say something. Clara. She looked up, startled by the sound of her name in his voice. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading across the porch. Silas emerged from the back room where he'd been listening. He didn't say anything, just settled into his chair and picked up his whittling. The knife moved in slow strokes, shaping the wood with patient hands. "He means it, you know," Silas said without looking up. "About you staying. He don't say things he don't mean." Clara dipped her pen in the ink and went back to work, but her mind wouldn't settle. She kept thinking about Garrett's smile, the way he'd looked at her through the window, the casual cruelty in his voice when he'd called her the one nobody wanted. She kept thinking about what he'd said. This valley's changing. There's a cost to stubbornness. And she kept thinking about the ledger, the gaps she'd filled in. The stories hidden in the numbers. 3 years. Garrett had been trying to buy this land for 3 years, and in all that time, Luke had never sold. Why? What was worth holding on to so tightly? And what would a man like Garrett do when patience finally ran out? The first customer stopped coming on a Tuesday, Clara noticed, because she had been expecting him. Mr. Walsh, the man who'd sold Luke the brown mare when his wife died, had promised to return for a saddle repair. His name was written in the appointment book in her careful hand. 10 o'clock, Tuesday morning. 10 o'clock came and went. So did 11. The clock on the wall ticked through the quiet minutes. By noon, Clara knew he wasn't coming. She didn't say anything to Luke. He didn't say anything either. But she saw him glance at the empty road, then look away, his jaw tight. The second customer canceled the following day, sent his boy with a note saying he'd found another stable to board his horses. No explanation. No apology. Just a few lines of cramped handwriting on a scrap of brown paper. By the end of the week, Clara had counted 7 cancellations and 3 customers who simply never showed. She recorded each one in the ledger with precise, emotionless strokes. The numbers didn't lie. Business was down nearly a third from the previous month. "It's because of me," she said to Luke on Friday evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the western hills. The sky had turned orange and pink, bleeding into purple at the edges. Silas had gone inside to start supper, and the smell of frying onions drifted through the open window. "Maybe," Luke said. "Maybe not. Don't do that." "Do what?" "Pretend you don't see what's happening." Clara kept her voice steady, though her hands wanted to shake. "Garrett's been talking. His men have been talking. They're squeezing you out." Luke was quiet for a moment. His coffee cup sat untouched on the porch rail, steam rising in the cooling air. "Folks talk," he said finally. "Always have. Doesn't mean they'll keep talking forever. And if they do, then I'll figure something out." Clara shook her head. "You should let me go. Find someone else. Someone without a past that follows them around like a hungry dog. We've been through this. The numbers are getting worse. I can show you the way things are heading. If this continues for another month." "I know." His voice was soft but firm. "I can read the books now. Thanks to you. I know exactly where we stand." "Then why won't you?" "Because it ain't right." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her stop. The setting sun caught his face, turning his eyes the color of amber. "What they're doing, Garrett. His people. All of them, it ain't right. And I won't let them win by giving them what they want. What they want is your land. What they want is to prove that people like us don't get to choose, don't get to build something that's ours." His jaw tightened. "I've been proving folks wrong my whole life, Clara. I'm not about to stop now." The warmth of hearing her name in his voice caught her off guard. She looked away, toward the corral where the horses stood peaceful in the fading light. "You're stubborn," she said. "So are you." "I'm practical." Practical would have meant not showing up that first morning. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You came anyway." Clara had no answer for that. The sun slipped lower. The first stars appeared, faint pinpricks against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice thin and lonesome, and after a moment, another answered. "Teach me something," Clara said suddenly. Luke raised an eyebrow. "What about horses? You said you understand them. Teach me." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set down his coffee and stood, the chair creaking beneath him. "All right. Come on." They walked to the corral together, their footsteps soft on the packed earth. The horses had gathered near the water trough, their coats gleaming in the last light. Luke whistled softly 2 low notes, and a chestnut mare lifted her head, ears pricked forward. "That's Penny," he said. "Gentlest horse I've got. Good place to start." He showed Clara how to approach from the side, not straight on. How to let the horse smell her hand before touching, giving the animal time to decide if she was friend or threat. How to read the ears forward meant curious, back meant wary, flat meant trouble. "Horses don't lie," Luke said, running his hand along Penny's neck. The mare's coat was warm under his palm, smooth as silk where the winter roughness had shed away. "They can't. Everything they feel shows up somewhere. In their body, their eyes, the way they move." Sounds simpler than people. In some ways. He handed Clara a brush, the handle worn smooth from years of use. "Here, long strokes. Follow the direction of the hair. She'll let you know if you're doing it right." Clara took the brush, the chaptai, drew it along Penny's flank, feeling the warmth of the horse's body beneath the coat, the solid muscle and bone. Penny shifted her weight, leaning slightly into the touch. "She likes you," Luke said. "How can you tell?" "See how her head's dropping. That's trust. She's relaxing because you're not asking anything of her. Just being here." Clara kept brushing. The rhythm was soothing long stroke. Short pause. Long stroke again. The smell of horse and hay filled her nose, earthy and alive. Penny's breath came slow and even, warm puffs against Clara's arm. "Emmett used to say horses are mirrors," Luke said. He was leaning against the fence now, watching her work, the last light catching the angles of his face. "They reflect back whatever you bring to them. Come at them scared. They get scared. Come at them calm. They calm down too. And if you come at them angry, then you get bit." He smiled slightly. "Learned that one the hard way," Clara laughed. The sound surprised her rusty, unfamiliar in her throat. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed, really laughed, without thinking about who might be listening. Luke was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something soft in it, something careful, like he was holding back words he wasn't sure he should say. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Depends on what it is." "The auction. That day." He paused. "What were you thinking? When nobody bid?" Clara's hand stilled on Penny's flank. The brush hung motionless in her grip. The question sat between them, heavy and unexpected, like a stone dropped into still water. "I was thinking about numbers," she said finally. "Numbers. I was counting. The men in the crowd, the women who'd already been bought, the seconds ticking by." She resumed brushing, not looking at him. "It's what I do when things get bad. I count. I calculate. I turn everything into numbers because numbers don't hurt." "Did it work?" "No." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It didn't work at all." The silence stretched between them. Penny shifted her weight, her tail swishing at invisible flies. The coyote called again, closer now. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Luke said. "It's not your fault. I know, but I'm sorry anyway." Clara finally looked at him. The stars were out now, bright against the darkening sky, and his face was half in shadow, but his eyes, she could see those clearly, steady, honest. "The man who raised you," she said. "Emmett. Is he still alive?" Luke shook his head. "Passed 6 years ago. Left me this land. This station." He straightened up, brushed dust from his trousers. "Everything I've got came from him. That's why I won't sell. Not to Garrett. Not to anyone. He must have been a good man. He was the best man I ever knew." Luke's voice went quiet. Didn't talk much, but he showed up. Every single day. Rain or shine. Good times or hard ones. He showed up and he did the work, and he never once complained about what life handed him. From inside the house, Silas called out, his voice cutting through the evening air. "Supper's on the table. You two planning to eat tonight or just stand around with the horses till morning?" Luke smiled. "We should go in." "Yes." But neither of them moved. Not right away. They stood there in the gathering dark, the horses breathing softly around them, the smell of hay and sage and something that might have been the first hint of summer on the wind. "Thank you," Clara said at last, "for teaching me." "Any time." They walked back to the house together, closer this time than before, their shoulders almost touching as they climbed the porch steps and went inside to where the lamp burned warm and the table was set, and Silas was already reaching for the biscuits. Clara ate more than she had in weeks. The food was simple beans and cornbread and strong coffee, but it tasted better than anything she could remember. The kitchen was warm with lamplight and quiet conversation and the comfortable sounds of 3 people sharing a meal. After supper, she helped clear the dishes while Luke went to check on the horses one last time. The soapy water was warm on her hands, and the familiar rhythm of washing and drying settled something in her chest. Silas handed her a plate. "Saw something today," he said, his voice low. "When I went to town for supplies." Clara looked up. "What?" "Garrett. He was meeting with some men outside the land office. Couldn't hear what they were saying, but they had papers spread out on a barrel. Maps. Looked like—" Clara's hands went still in the water. "What kind of maps?" "Property maps. Near as I could tell. Had survey lines drawn on them. Boundary markers." Silas's weathered face was troubled, deep lines cutting between his brows. "One of the men was pointing at something, right about where this station sits, if I had to guess." The warmth of the evening drained away. Clara set down the plate she'd been drying. "He's planning something," she said. "Seems like—" Luke's footsteps sounded on the porch. The door opened, and he came inside, bringing the cool night air with him. "Did you recognize the other men?" Clara asked Silas quickly. "One of them, Harvey Polk. He's a surveyor out of Cheyenne. Does contract work for the territory." Luke stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved between Clara and Silas. "What's going on?" Clara met his gaze. The question forming in her mind was cold and sharp. "The water rights to Miller's Creek," she said slowly. "Do you have documentation proving they belong to this property?" Luke frowned. "Emmett always said we did. Been that way since before I was born." "But is it written down anywhere filed with the territory?" The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. The Territorial Land Office was closed when Clara arrived in town the next morning. A handwritten sign hung crooked on the door. "Gone to Cheyenne, back in 2 weeks." 2 weeks. Clara stood on the boardwalk, staring at the words until they blurred. Garrett had planned this, had known exactly when to move. exactly when the one person who could verify land records would be away. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window glass, a thin woman in a faded dress, looking older than her years. Behind her, the town was waking up. Shopkeepers swept their porches. A wagon rattled past, its wheels grinding against the rutted street. Two women crossed toward the mercantile, their heads bent together in conversation. One of them glanced at Clara, whispered something to the other. They both laughed, high and sharp, like the call of crows. Clara turned away and walked toward the edge of town. Her boots felt heavy on the wooden planks. The morning sun was warm on her shoulders, but she couldn't stop shivering. She had checked the station's files the night before, gone through every drawer, every box, every scrap of paper Emmett had left behind. There was nothing. No deed, no water rights documentation, nothing but old receipts and faded letters and a photograph of a woman she assumed was Emmett's wife. Her face soft and blurred by time. Luke had inherited the land, but the paperwork proving it was somewhere else. Maybe in Cheyenne, maybe lost entirely, maybe never filed at all. And Garrett knew it. The walk back to the station took longer than usual. Clara's feet kept slowing, her mind churning through possibilities that all led nowhere. She could write to the territorial office, file an inquiry, but that would take months. Garrett could have surveyors on the property by then, could have lawyers, could have anything he wanted. She was so lost in thought that she didn't see the mud puddle until she was already in it. Her right foot plunged into the muck up to her ankle. Cold brown water flooded her boot, soaking through the worn leather, seeping between her toes. She stumbled forward, arms pinwheeling for balance, and her left foot slid sideways on the slick surface. She went down hard. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Her palms hit the mud first, sinking deep into the thick brown sludge. Her skirt tangled around her legs like wet rope. She tried to push herself up, but her hands slipped, and she fell again, this time face first. Mud filled her mouth, her nose. She sputtered, gagging on the taste of dirt and horse dung and rotted grass. Something sharp pressed into her cheek, a stone, maybe, or a piece of broken wood. She rolled onto her back, coughing, spitting, trying to clear her airways. Above her, the sky was a perfect cloudless blue, mocking in its beauty. She lay there in the muck, her dress ruined, her hair plastered to her face in thick clumps, and laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the laugh of someone who had finally run out of dignity, who had nothing left to lose because she'd already lost everything worth keeping. Footsteps approached, stopped. Well, Garrett's voice, smooth as oil, sharp as broken glass. Looks like somebody took a tumble. Clara didn't move. She stared at the sky, at the single hawk circling high overhead, and said nothing. Need a hand. She could hear the satisfaction in his voice, could picture the smile spreading across his face like rot across a peach. No. Suit yourself. His boots creaked as he shifted his weight. She could see them from the corner of her eye-polished leather, not a speck of dust on them. Though I have to say, this is a fitting picture. The auction girl, flat on her back in the dirt, right where she belongs. Clara's fingers curled into the mud. Her nails scraped against small stones buried in the muck, cutting shallow furrows in the earth. I came to deliver a message to your employer, Garrett continued, but since you're here, you can pass it along. His shadow fell across her face, blocking the sun. I've filed a claim on the water rights to Miller's Creek. Survey's already been done. Papers are being processed in Cheyenne as we speak. Clara closed her eyes. The mud was seeping through her dress now, cold and wet against her spine, soaking into her underclothes. She could feel it everywhere between her shoulder blades, along her ribs, pooling in the small of her back. By the time your Mr. Callahan figures out what's happening, it'll be too late. The creek will belong to me, and without water, That precious little station of his won't be worth the dirt you're lying in." He paused. She heard him spit, and something wet landed on the ground beside her head. "Tell him I'm still willing to buy half what I offered before. That's more than fair, considering how things stand now." His footsteps retreated. The sound of a horse, the creak of saddle leather, then hoofbeats, fading away down the road toward town. Clara lay in the mud for a long time. The sun moved across the sky, warm on her face, even as the rest of her body grew cold and numb. The muck began to dry on her skin, cracking like old paint, pulling tight across her cheeks. A fly landed on her closed eyelid, walked across the thin skin, flew away. She thought about getting up, about walking back to the station, about facing Luke with this news. She couldn't move. This was how it ended. Then, not with a dramatic confrontation or a flash of righteousness, just a woman lying in a mud puddle, covered in filth, while the man who wanted to destroy her life walked away with a spring in his step. She had been a fool to think it could be different. A fool to think that hard work and clean numbers could overcome what she was, what the world had decided she was the moment she stepped onto that auction platform and no one raised a hand. The auction girl, the one nobody wanted, the throwaway. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, cutting tracks through the mud on her temples. She didn't wipe them away. Let them fall. Let them mix with the dirt and the muck and everything else. Finally, when the sun had moved past noon and her muscles had gone stiff from lying still, she forced herself to sit up. Her dress was destroyed. Brown from collar to hem, her hair hung in clumped tangles around her face. Her hands were caked with dried mud, the lines of her palms etched in brown like the furrows of a plowed field. She looked down at herself and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, not determination. Something harder, colder, anger. She had spent her whole life trying to be invisible, trying not to take up space, trying to be so useful, so competent, so perfectly behaved that no one would have reason to throw her away. And where had it gotten her face down in the mud while men like Garrett laughed and took whatever they wanted? Clara stood up. Her legs shook, but they held. She looked toward town, then toward the hill road that led to the station. The station. Luke. Silas. The ledger with its neat columns. The small room with the lock on the door. The horses in the corral who didn't care about her past. Garrett wanted to take all of that away. Not because he needed the land. Not because the water rights mattered to him personally, but because he could. Because people like Clara weren't supposed to have things, weren't supposed to build anything worth keeping. She started walking. The mud dried on her skin as she moved. It pulled tight across her cheeks, cracked at the corners of her mouth. She must have looked like something risen from a grave. A ghost made of dirt and fury. Let them look. Let them whisper. Let them see what they'd made of her. When she reached the station, Luke was in the corral working with a young horse. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and his face went pale. "Clara, what happened?" She walked past him without stopping, through the gate, across the yard, up the porch steps, into the office. Silas looked up from his whittling. His knife stopped mid-stroke. "Lord have mercy." Clara went to her room, closed the door, stripped off the ruined dress and let it fall to the floor in a wet heap, poured water from the pitcher into the basin and scrubbed at her face, her arms, her hair. The water turned brown immediately. She dumped it out the window and poured more, scrubbed again. When she finally looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back, red-eyed, raw-skinned, hair still damp and tangled. But underneath all of that, something new. Something that had been buried for years beneath layers of politeness and deference and the desperate need to be acceptable. She put on her other dress, the gray one, pinned her hair back, straightened her shoulders. Then she went back to the office. Luke and Silas were both there, waiting. Their faces held the same expression, worry and confusion, and something that might have been fear. Clara sat down at the desk, opened the ledger, picked up her pen. "Garrett filed a claim on the water rights," she said. Her voice was steady, flat. "Papers are being processed in Cheyenne. He'll own the creek within weeks, unless we find documentation proving Emmett's original claim." Luke didn't move. "How do you know?" "He told me, while I was lying in the mud." She looked up at him. "He wanted me to deliver the message personally. Said he'll buy the station for half his original offer. He thinks you'll take it now." "Will I? That's not my decision." Silas set down his whittling. "There might be records in Cheyenne, old territorial files, something Emmett filed decades ago that's just been forgotten. Maybe." Clara turned back to the ledger. "Or maybe not. Either way, we have 2 weeks before the land office reopens. That's how long we have to find proof." Luke pulled a chair over and sat down across from her. He said quietly. Clara looked up. "You said we have 2 weeks. Not you have." Her pen stilled. "I did. Does that mean you're staying?" She thought about the mud, the laughter, the way Garrett had spit on the ground beside her like she was nothing more than garbage. "I'm staying," she said. "But not for you." "Then why?" Clara met his eyes. "Because I'm done lying in the dirt while men like him walk away." The pen moved across the page. Numbers. Columns. The careful architecture of a business that might be crumbling around them. But somewhere in those numbers, there had to be an answer, a clue. Something that would lead them to proof. She just had to find it before Garrett did. And then, buried in a stack of old receipts at the bottom of a forgotten drawer, she found something. A faded piece of paper, folded twice, with handwriting she didn't recognize. A letter, addressed to Emmett Callahan, from Martha Hensley. The letter was dated 18 years ago. Clara unfolded it with care, the paper brittle and yellowed at the edges, threatening to tear along the creases. The handwriting was precise, each letter formed with the deliberate attention of someone taught that penmanship reflected character. "Dear Mr. Callahan, I am writing to confirm our agreement regarding the water rights to Miller's Creek. As discussed, I relinquish any claim my late husband's estate may have had to the northern tributary in exchange for your assistance during the difficult winter of 1866. The original territorial documentation is held at the land office in Cheyenne, filed under deed number 1847-WR-203. I trust this matter is now settled between us. Respectfully, Martha Hensley." Clara read it twice, then a third time. The words blurred and sharpened as her mind raced through the implications. "Luke." He was at her side in an instant, leaning over her shoulder. She could feel the warmth of him, smell horse and sage and the particular scent that was just him. "What is it?" She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly with each word. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. "She gave up her claim," he said. 18 years ago, in writing." Clara pointed to the key line, her finger trembling slightly. "And there's a deed number, filed in Cheyenne. If that document still exists, then Garrett's claim means nothing." "Maybe." Clara took the letter back, handling it like the fragile treasure it was. "But this also means Mrs. Hensley knew about the original documentation, knew exactly where it was filed, and she never mentioned any of this when she came here last week." The implication hung between them like smoke. You think she's working with Garrett? I don't know what to think. Clara folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, feeling the paper crinkle against her hip. But I think we need to ask her directly. The monthly cattle market was scheduled for Saturday. Clara had seen the notices posted around town, the biggest gathering of ranchers and buyers in the territory, held in the wide field just south of Copper Bend. Everyone would be there, including Martha Hensley. They spent the week preparing. Luke groomed the horses until their coats gleamed like polished copper. Clara organized the accounts, creating a neat portfolio of records that showed every transaction, every satisfied customer, every penny earned and spent honestly. If they were going to face the town, they would do it with their heads high. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, the sky a pale blue that deepened as the sun climbed. Clara dressed in her gray dress, the only decent one she had left, and pinned her hair back with extra care. Her hands trembled as she fastened the buttons. She pressed them flat against her skirt until they stilled. The market was already crowded when they arrived. Wagons lined the edges of the field in crooked rows. Cattle lowed in temporary pens, their voices rising in a constant low complaint. Men in dusty hats haggled over prices while women examined bolts of fabric and jars of preserves at the merchant tables. The smell of animals and dust and frying food hung thick in the air. And everyone turned to look when Clara walked in beside Luke. The whispers started immediately, a low hum that spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Clara kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, the way Mama had taught her all those years ago. The auction girl. Living out there with him, bold as you please. No shame at all, I tell you. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't slow down. They made their way to the spot he'd reserved near the horse pens, a small section of fence where he could display his stock. The first hour was brutal. Customers who had done business with Luke for years walked past without meeting his eyes. One man started toward them, then stopped short when his wife grabbed his arm and pulled him back, hissing something in his ear. A group of young cowboys snickered and made comments just loud enough to carry. Clara recorded everything in her ledger, every slight, every turned back, every whispered insult. She wrote them down with the same precise hand she used for figures. Let them see her writing. Let them wonder what she was documenting and who might read it later. By mid-morning, they had made exactly one sale, a pair of workhorses, to an old farmer who was half-deaf and probably hadn't heard any of the gossip. And then Mrs. Hensley arrived. Her wagon rolled into the market like a ship entering harbor, the matched gray horses high-stepping and proud. The crowd parted for her without being asked. Men touched their hats. Women nodded with practiced deference. She stepped down with the help of her driver, her black dress immaculate despite the dust, her silver-headed cane gleaming in the morning sun. Her eyes found Clara immediately. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the crowded field. The noise of the market seemed to fade the lowing cattle, the shouting vendors, the constant hum of conversation all dropping away until there was nothing but the two of them and the weight of what lay between them. Then Mrs. Hensley began walking toward them, and the crowd parted before her like water before a prow. She stopped 5 feet from their table. Up close, Clara could see the fine lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her dark hair, the careful set of her mouth. Miss Bennett. Her voice carried clearly over the market noise. People nearby fell silent, watching, listening. I hear you've been doing some research into old records. I have. Found anything of interest? Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew the letter, unfolded it carefully, held it up so Mrs. Hensley could see her own handwriting from 18 years past. I found this. Something flickered across the widow's face. Gone so quickly Clara almost missed its surprise. Maybe. Or recognition. Or guilt. Or all three tangled together. That's a very old letter, Mrs. Hensley said carefully. 18 years old. Written to Emmett Callahan, confirming that you gave up any claim to the water rights on Miller's Creek. Clara kept her voice steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs. In exchange for his help during a hard winter. The silence around them deepened. People were openly staring now. Transactions forgotten, haggling suspended. It also mentions a deed number, Clara continued, filed in Cheyenne, documentation that proves Mr. Callahan's claim to those water rights goes back decades long before any filing Garrett could make. Mrs. Hensley's grip tightened on her cane. Her knuckles went white against the silver head. You've been busy. I have. The question is, why didn't you mention any of this when you came to the station? You knew that documentation existed. You knew exactly where it was filed. The widow stood perfectly still. Her face was unreadable. A mask carved from years of practice. But her eyes were calculating, weighing, measuring. Garrett came to me 6 months ago, she said finally. Her voice dropped low, meant only for Clara and Luke now. He wanted to partner on acquiring this land. Said we could split the water rights, expand both our operations into something bigger. And you agreed to help him. I considered it. Mrs. Hensley's jaw tightened. He was persuasive, and I was tired of watching this station struggle along on the edge of failure year after year. I thought perhaps it would be better for everyone if the land was in more capable hands. More capable, Luke spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but hard. You mean richer? Mrs. Hensley met his gaze without flinching. Yes, the word hung there, naked and honest. I grew up poor, Mr. Callahan, poorer than you can imagine. I married a man I didn't love because he had land and I had nothing but a carpet bag and dreams that didn't fill my belly. I spent 40 years building what I have now. Her voice hardened. I won't apologize for wanting to protect it, for wanting to grow it. That's what people like me have to do to survive. People like you, Clara said. What about people like me? Mrs. Hensley turned to look at her. Really look, for the first time. Her eyes traveled over Clara's worn dress, her carefully pinned hair, her work-roughened hands. I was a mail-order bride, the widow said quietly. Did you know that I came out here with nothing but hope and a head full of foolish dreams? The women in town called me things far worse than what they call you. Clara didn't respond. Couldn't find the words. I survived, Mrs. Hensley continued. I built something from nothing. I made myself into someone they couldn't dismiss or ignore. Her voice dropped even lower. But I never forgot what it felt like. Being looked at that way, being talked about that way, being treated like you were worth less than the dirt under their boots. She reached out and took the letter from Clara's hand, looked at it for a long moment, her eyes moving over her own words from 18 years past. I wrote this when I still remembered what it felt like to need help, she said. Emmett Callahan saved my cattle that winter, saved my ranch, saved everything I had worked for. She folded the letter carefully. I have spent the last 6 months trying to forget that debt, trying to convince myself that what Garrett wanted was just good business. She looked up. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something fierce, something that might have been shame finally acknowledged. I was wrong. She turned and walked to her wagon, opened a leather case that sat on the seat, withdrew a sheaf of papers and walked back, holding them out to Luke. These are copies of the original water rights documentation, she said. I had them made years ago, when I first considered what my holdings were worth. The originals are in Cheyenne, but these will serve until the land office reopens. Luke stared at the papers in his hands. Why? He asked. Mrs. Hensley straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. Because I will not be the kind of woman who forgets where she came from. she said. Not even for land, not even for water, not even for all the money in the territory. She turned to Clara. You asked once what I did when people talked about me, when I was young and desperate and alone. Clara nodded. I outlived them. Mrs. Hensley smiled a real smile this time, with something fierce burning behind it. And I intend to do the same to Garrett. Would you care to help? Before Clara could answer. A commotion rose at the edge of the market. Voices raised in anger, horses whinnying. The crowd shifted and parted. Garrett pushed through, his face mottled red with fury. Behind him came the surveyor from Cheyenne and two men Clara didn't recognize, their hands resting on their belts. You, he pointed at Mrs. Hensley, his finger shaking with rage. You gave me your word. The widow turned to face him, her cane planted firmly in the dirt. I changed my mind. You can't do that. We had an agreement. We shook hands on it. We had a conversation. Mr. Garrett. Nothing more. Mrs. Hensley's voice was cold as creek water in January. And now that conversation is finished. Garrett's eyes swept over the scene, the papers in Luke's hands. Clara standing straight and unbroken, Mrs. Hensley blocking his path like a wall of black silk and silver steel. His face contorted, something ugly moved behind his eyes, something that had been hiding beneath the smooth surface all along. This isn't finished, he said. Yes. Mrs. Hensley stepped forward, and Garrett, big, wealthy, powerful Garrett, actually stepped back. It is. She turned her back on him completely, dismissed him like he was nothing more than a fly buzzing at her window. Miss Bennet, she said, I find myself in need of someone with your particular skills, someone who understands what numbers really mean and isn't afraid to dig through old records. Would you be interested in discussing an arrangement? Clara looked at Luke, at Silas, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd with a grin splitting his weathered face, at the townspeople who were staring with expressions ranging from shock to grudging respect. And then she looked at Garrett, standing frozen in the dust, his schemes crumbling around him, defeated not by force or lawyers, but by the simple, unexpected choice of a woman who had remembered what it meant to struggle. I think, Clara said slowly, that can be arranged. The market erupted into noise questions, exclamations, the buzz of gossip reversing direction like a river suddenly changing course. But Clara barely heard any of it. She was looking at Luke, who was looking at her. And in his eyes she saw something she had stopped believing was possible. A future. The question now was what kind of future would she choose to build? A month passed. The morning light came earlier now, summer pushing spring aside with long golden fingers that reached through Clara's window before she was ready to wake. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the station coming alive around her. Silas coughing in the kitchen. That same dry rattle he always had first thing. The horses shifting and snorting in the corral. The creak of porch boards as Luke made his first rounds. Her room, her window, her life. She still had trouble believing it sometimes. Clara dressed and pinned her hair back, the movements automatic now after weeks of practice. The face in the small mirror looked different than it had 2 months ago. Fuller in the cheeks, less pinched around the eyes. The face of someone who ate 3 meals a day and slept through the night without startling awake at every unfamiliar sound. The ledger sat on her desk, its spine cracked from daily use. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover before heading out to the main room. Silas had coffee ready. He poured her a cup without being asked, his trembling hands steadier in the morning cool than they would be by afternoon. On the table beside him sat his latest carving, 2 horses standing side by side, and behind them the shape of a small cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. The details were so fine, Clara could see individual shingles on the tiny roof. Mrs. Hensley's expecting you at 10, he said without looking up. I know. She's particular about punctuality. Doesn't abide lateness. I know that too. Silas grunted and went back to his whittling. A new piece of wood this time, pale and fresh. Clara couldn't tell yet what shape it would become. She took her coffee out to the porch. Luke was in the corral, working with a young bay mare who had arrived just last week. The horse was skittish, prone to startling at shadows, but under Luke's patient hands she was beginning to settle. He moved around her in slow circles, speaking words too soft for Clara to hear, his body relaxed and unhurried. The mare's ears flicked toward him, forward now, not back, curious, not afraid, learning to trust. Clara watched them for a long time, her coffee growing cool in her hands. The station had changed in the past month. 3 new customers had come, ranchers who had heard about Mrs. Hensley's backing and decided to give Luke Callahan another look. 2 of his old customers had returned as well, sheepish and apologetic, offering excuses about having been too busy to come by earlier. Luke had welcomed them back without comment. That was his way. No grudges, no lectures, just a nod and a handshake and a fair price for honest work. The book showed a small profit for the first time in 8 months. Not much, but enough. Enough to buy new feed for the horses. Enough to repair the fence section that had been sagging since before Clara arrived. Enough to prove that the station could survive. Clara finished her coffee and went back inside to gather her things for the ride to the Hensley ranch. The work there was different than what she did for Luke. More complex. Mrs. Hensley's operation was 10 times larger, with accounts that sprawled across multiple ledgers and investments that stretched to Denver and beyond. Clara spent 1 day each week there now, sorting through the tangles, bringing order to years of accumulated chaos. The widow paid well, more than well. But that wasn't why Clara had agreed. She had agreed because Mrs. Hensley had asked. Not demanded. Not insisted. Asked. In that quiet moment after the market when everyone else had drifted away and the 2 women stood alone beside the Hensley wagon. I could use someone like you, Mrs. Hensley had said. Someone who sees what numbers actually mean. I already have a position. I know. I'm not asking you to leave it. The widow's eyes had been sharp and assessing, but not unkind. 1 day a week, that's all. You can keep working for Callahan the rest of the time. Clara had considered it, had thought about the woman's previous alliance with Garrett. The years of calculated coldness, the scheming mind that treated everything as leverage. But she had also thought about the letter, about what it meant that Mrs. Hensley had kept it all those years, about the look on her face when she handed over those water rights documents, relief and shame, and something that might have been redemption, all tangled together. People could change. Or maybe they didn't change so much as remember who they had been before the world hardened them. All right, Clara had said. 1 day a week. Now she saddled Penny the gentle chestnut mare who had somehow become hers. A gift from Luke that he'd presented without ceremony or explanation, and rode out toward the Hensley ranch. The road wound through rolling hills dotted with sage and early wildflowers, purple and yellow against the green. The sky stretched overhead, a vast blue bowl with nothing to interrupt it but the distant smudge of mountains. She thought about the auction as she rode, about standing on that platform with the sun in her eyes and the silence stretching out like a held breath. No one had raised a hand that day, but someone had asked a question, the right question. And everything had changed. The work at the Hensley ranch took most of the day. Clara found an error in the cattle accounts, a discrepancy that had been compounding quietly for months, and spent 2 hours tracking it back to its source. Mrs. Hensley watched over her shoulder for part of it, asking sharp questions, testing Clara's reasoning at every step. At the end, the widow nodded once, her highest form of praise. Good work, she said. Same time next week. Clara rode back to the station as the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains. The light turned golden, then orange, then the deep rose pink of a Wyoming sunset. She let Penny set her own pace, content to watch the colors shift and change across the vast sky. When she arrived, Luke was sitting on the porch, 2 chairs now, instead of 1. Silas had built the second just last week, muttering something about his aching back and needing a proper place to rest his bones. But Clara had noticed that the old man rarely used it himself. She unsaddled Penny and turned her loose in the corral, then climbed the porch steps and settled into the empty chair. The wood was still warm from the afternoon sun. Luke handed her a cup of coffee without a word. They sat together as the last light faded. The first stars appeared, faint pinpricks against the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called, and after a long moment, another answered from farther away. "Mrs. Hensley offered me more days," Clara said. Luke didn't react, just sipped his coffee, his eyes on the horizon where the last color was bleeding away. 2 days a week instead of 1, better pay. "What did you tell her?" "I said I'd think about it." He nodded slowly. "And what are you thinking?" Clara turned the cup in her hands, feeling the warmth of the tin against her palms. The coffee inside had gone cool, but she didn't mind. "I'm thinking that I like it here," she said. "I like the work. I like the horses." She paused. "I like knowing where I belong." Luke waited. "That's not something I've had in a long time." She finished quietly. "Not since I was a girl." The silence stretched between them, comfortable and unhurried, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. "Remember what I asked you," Luke said finally, "that first day by the corral in town. What kind of work I was looking for?" "That's right." He turned to look at her, his face half in shadow, half lit by the rising moon. "Did you ever find it?" Clara thought about the ledgers, the numbers that told stories, the careful work of making chaos into order. She thought about Penny and Silas and the small room with the lock on the door. She thought about Mrs. Hensley's sharp questions and Luke's patient hands with the horses and the way this place had started to feel like somewhere she was meant to be. "Yes," she said. "I found it." "Good." He went back to watching the stars. Clara did the same. The night sounds rose around them, crickets singing in the grass, the soft shuffle of horses settling in the corral, the distant whisper of wind through the sage. The air smelled of dust and green growing things and the particular sweetness of a Wyoming evening in early summer. After a while, Silas's voice drifted through the open window behind them. "You two planning to sit out there all night, or is somebody going to help me wash these dishes?" Luke stood and offered Clara his hand. She took it. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. He pulled her to her feet, and for a moment they stood close together on the porch, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his light eyes. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking the right question, when nobody else bothered to ask anything at all." Something shifted in his expression. That almost smile she had come to know so well, the one that barely touched his mouth but softened his whole face. "Thank you for answering," he said. He released her hand and walked inside. Clara stood on the porch a moment longer, looking out at the dark hills and the star-filled sky and the station that had become her home. Then she followed him in. The kitchen was warm with lamplight and the lingering smell of supper. Silas stood at the basin, his hands submerged in soapy water, grumbling about young people who had no consideration for old men with aching joints. Luke picked up a dish towel and started drying before Silas could complain any louder. Clara took another towel from the hook by the stove and joined them. The three of them worked in companionable silence, passing plates and cups and bowls between them. The rhythm of the task was as natural as breathing now: wash, rinse, dry, stack. The kind of simple work that left room for thinking, or for not thinking at all, when the last dish was dried and put away. Silas retreated to his room with a muttered good night. His footsteps faded down the short hallway. A door closed. Then silence. Luke hung his towel on its hook, leaned against the counter. "I've been thinking," he said. Clara finished folding her own towel, set it beside his. "About what? The future." He crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. "What happens next? The station's doing better now. We've got enough coming in to make some improvements. Maybe add another corral. Take on more horses." Clara waited. "Could use a partner," he said. "Someone to help manage things properly. Someone who knows the books better than I ever will. Someone I can trust." Clara's breath caught in her chest. "A partner," she repeated. "If you're interested." His eyes met hers, steady and serious. "You've already proved yourself 10 times over. I figure it's time I made it official." She looked at him, this quiet man who had asked one simple question and changed her entire life, who had given her work when no one else would, who had never once treated her like the auction girl, the unwanted one, the burden everyone else saw when they looked at her. "I might be interested," she said. "Depending on the terms." The corner of his mouth lifted. "We can negotiate." "I'll want everything in writing. Wouldn't expect anything less. And I'll need to see the books first. Make sure I know exactly what I'm getting into." Luke laughed a real laugh, warm and surprised. The first she'd ever heard from him. "Clara Bennett, you drive a hard bargain." "I learned from the best." She smiled back, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she could remember. "When do we start? Tomorrow's as good a time as any." "Then tomorrow it is." Outside, the Wyoming night stretched vast and endless, full of stars and silence and the promise of everything still to come. The horses dozed in the corral. The station sat solid and steady on its hillside, a small outpost of belonging in the wide and often lonesome world. And Clara Bennett, who had once stood on an auction platform while no one raised a hand for her, finally understood what it meant to choose her own place in the world and to have that choice honored by the people who mattered most. There is a quietness that comes after a story like this one, something that settles in the chest and stays there for a while, not heavy, exactly, but present, familiar, maybe, the way an old song is familiar even when you haven't heard it in years. Many of us have stood where Clara stood, perhaps not on an auction platform, but in places where we felt unseen, passed over, wondering if anyone would ever ask the right question. Some of us have carried that feeling for a long time, tucked away where it wouldn't trouble anyone else. And some of us have been Luke, too uncertain whether the small kindnesses we offer make any difference at all in a world that doesn't always notice. It's all right if this story stirred something you weren't expecting. These things don't need to be named or understood tonight. They're allowed to simply rest, the way evening light rests on a hillside before it fades into dark. What matters is that you stayed. You listened. You let these folks walk beside you for a little while. Thank you for that. And thank you for being here. Wherever you are, on this wide and often lonesome road,